Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is a second recorded lecture for the 1970s. And in this one, I'm going to be covering the Nixon's foreign policy. And so, really, Nixon's foreign policy, besides Watergate as president, is really what he's most known for and recognized for in American history. And so, the first one we're going to talk about, which actually was a brilliant foreign policy strategy, and that is called détente. Really, Nixon realized something that previous presidents really hadn't, is that the Soviet Union and China had actually had a falling out in the years before his presidency, because you would think, because they're the two largest communist nations in the world, that they would probably have a close alliance, and they did initially. But as time goes along, Mao, who's in the picture shaking Nixon's hand here, really became distrustful of the Soviet Union and kind of felt like that the government there had become too bureaucratic, too many government people in the Politburo of the communist government, and felt like it wasn't true communist revolution enough. And so what Nixon does, really, and Henry Kissinger, his security advisor and later his Secretary of State, helps really realize this as well. And so Kissinger travels to China, first American Secretary of State to have done that, to kind of see if the United States and China can get back on good working terms again, and does the same thing in the Soviet Union. And so Nixon eventually gets invited to go to China, and which he actually got criticism for in the middle of the Cold War, and like, oh, he's favoring China, but actually what Nixon traveling to China was brilliant. And he becomes the first American president to travel to China. And now it's not a matter of if, but when an American president is going to travel to China. And one of the things that Nixon does when he travels to China is he works out an agreement. Now, Mao has stepped down as chairman. And so later it's going to be Deng Xiaoping, which I can't remember if he was in office technically yet, but he comes in afterwards. And they work out a trade agreement where the United States and China begin trading again. And if you look at today, China is one of the most important trading partners for the United States. Of course, I know there's talk of trade wars and so forth going on currently when I'm making this lecture, but from the 1970s until here in the last year, the United States and China have been very important trading partners. And so Nixon implements this foreign policy with the Soviet Union and China known as détente. And what that means, it remains relaxed tensions. Now, the Soviet Union watches this and they're like, well, hey, if the United States is having relaxed tensions with China, why can't we as well? And so they invite Nixon to come meet with the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, as well. And so, but we're going to talk about Nixon's policy with Vietnam as well. And so, this détente works brilliantly by playing the Chinese and the Soviets off against each other. And Nixon was able to meet with En Lai and also Chairman Mao. And this is actually pictures of Nixon and Kissinger in China. And this is Nixon. Actually, his wife is kind of far behind him, and he's examining China's pride of their military. And Nixon was trying to eat with chopsticks, which is kind of humorous. I've seen the video footage. It was kind of awkward, but I'm not very good at eating chopsticks either, so I'm not going to criticize too much. But when he gets invited to the Soviet Union after creating a trade agreement with China, Nixon ends up signing an historic nuclear arms deal known as SALT I. All it stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And so the SALT I treaty, what it did is it froze the number of strategic ballistic missile launchers. So like at the current level, so not going to build any new ones, and provided for the addition of new submarine launched ballistic missiles. So instead of having these land-based ballistic missiles, they're eventually going to move towards submarine nuclear missiles and so forth. Also, they began kind of limiting the number of ICBMs. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are the ones that kind of go into outer space and then come down and rain havoc on whoever. I call them civilization killers. And so basically what it is, does it end the threat of nuclear war? No. Does it really get rid of nuclear weapons? No. But here's the deal. It's the first time that the United States and the Soviet Union had agreed to a nuclear arms reduction. Okay, that's a big step in the Cold War. Eisenhower was going to do this with Nikita Khrushchev until the U-2 spy plane incident happened. And so, but what it did is it kind of slowed things down in the Cold War and showed that there was an easing of tensions. Now, Nixon, let's look at how he handles the Vietnam War during his time in office. So Nixon did not want to abandon Vietnam and lose credibility for the United States or be the first president to lose a war. It's one of the things Nixon always, Johnson always talked about, is he wanted to be the first American president to lose a war. Nixon wanted peace, but he wanted peace with honor. And so to settle things down at home, Nixon began withdrawing U.S. troops and turning more of the fighting over to the South Vietnamese that was called Vietnamization. Okay, so American troop levels dropped from 543,000 in 1968 to 334,000 in 1971 to barely 24,000 in early 1973. American casualties and political liabilities they entailed dropped correspondingly, but the killing in Vietnam continued because the second part of Nixon's plan is he's going to bomb the living crap out of North Vietnam. Now, this leads to Nixon doctrine. Okay, so similar to Eisenhower's doctrine and the Truman doctrine, but what this was is that the United States would honor its existing defense commitments, but other countries would have to fight their own conflicts, even if they're resisting communism across the world, without large bodies of American troops. And so that kind of did to win over some of the American public to his foreign policy. So Nixon does intensify bombing of North Vietnam. And to step up the pressure, Nixon in March of 1969 ordered secret air attacks on neutral Cambodia, though whose territories North Vietnamese had been moving supplies and reinforcements to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The secret war in Cambodia culminated in April 30th, 1970 in an incursion to Cambodia to destroy enemy havens there. In late 1971, as American troops withdrew from the region, communist forces infiltrated back in and stepped up their attacks. The next spring, North Vietnamese forces launched a major offensive against South Vietnam. Le Duan ordered this, who was the leader of North Vietnam. In April, as the fighting intensified, Nixon ordered B-52 bombing raids against North Vietnam. And a month later, he approved the mining of North Vietnamese ports to destroy some of their ships. China no longer threatened to intervene thanks to détente, so you don't have to worry about China getting involved. And the North Vietnamese might have felt more isolated, but supplies from the China and the Soviet Union continued, and they fought on. At home, the anti-war movement continued to grow, with the mobilization day bringing 500,000 people to D.C. And when news of the secret war in Cambodia came out, student protests intensified. Okay. And unfortunately, the American morale was declining. Of course, we still had some of the poorest Americans fighting in the conflict. So Nixon's pushing for Vietnamization, turning the war over to the ARVN forces, South Vietnam's forces, and also peace with honor. So we're going to try to have peace, but we're not going to say that we lost the war to kind of make us feel better. And so, like I said, he does reduce troop levels, but he increased the bombing of North Vietnam and also bombed Cambodia and so forth, which had not happened before his presidency. Now, because of the incursion to Cambodia came out in the press, students at Kent State University protested, and kind of jumpy National Guardsmen fired into the crowd after their officer ordered them to, and it killed 4 people and wounded many more. And this guy right here laying here was one of the ones who was killed. And here's a picture of them shooting tear gas, and it was a terrible day in American history. You also had a shooting at Jackson State that killed 2, and I mentioned in a previous lecture, I have looked online to trying to find pictures of this incident, and I can't find any. At least they're available on Google. So also the My Lai massacre, even though it happened during the Tet Offensive in 1968, came out in 1969, so that's a public relations nightmare. And some troops even refused to go into combat. They did as little as they possibly could to risk losing their lives and so forth. Kissinger continued to try to meet with North Vietnamese officials in Paris. In fact, they did so without even meeting, without consulting South Vietnam. And one of the things that ends up happening is when the ceasefire happens in 1973, South Vietnam government was not part of the agreement, and the United States and North Vietnam signs it without their approval, and then the U.S. just kind of hands it to them and says, "Hey, you need to sign this." And this is kind of one of the kind of the sour taste of the Vietnam War, because we kind of abandoned our commitments in South Vietnam, and they're kind of forced to sign it. And I read a quote that was fascinating by the leader of South Vietnam at the time. He said that they kind of felt like that they were the former mistress of the United States, and so now the United States has gone on elsewhere, and they are forgotten. So North Vietnam promised to stop. They kept their troops where they were, and so South Vietnam was very angered about this because they wanted all North Vietnamese army troops out of South Vietnam, and they agreed to stop fighting for the most part. But what ends up happening is the next year after the U.S. pulls out, they renew the fighting. They push back South Vietnamese forces. In April of 1975, South Vietnam's government falls, and Vietnam is united under communism. What is also that happens there is a lot of South Vietnamese people try to flee to Taiwan, including the leader of South Vietnam. And then you also had them try to escape. The United States Navy could have come in and evacuated many of the South Vietnamese people that were loyal to the U.S. government peacefully, but didn't happen under Gerald Ford administration because of the stain of the Vietnam War. Later, we allow a lot of Vietnamese, particularly the Hmong people, immigrate to the United States. That's why the United States has a large Vietnamese population that lives in our country. In fact, I've taught many Vietnamese students over the years, particularly when I taught at Richardson, and so forth. But it's kind of one of the dark periods in American history where how we handled the Vietnam War is not exactly something that the United States is typically proud of. One of the things that does happen when the North Vietnamese army is successful, those that supported the South Vietnamese government, they get sent to these re-education camps, and some of them are in prison for years and years to try to basically brainwash them into communism. And that's another tragedy of the war. American POWs are released. That's one of the things Nixon did during his administration, is focus on the POWs and missing in action. Some are released, but some were not. In fact, in the 1990s, the United States government pressured the Vietnamese government to let us at least try to find out what happened to them. And Senators John Kerry and John McCain, one who had been American POW, and then John Kerry had been an American veteran who ended up opposing the war, went over there and was able to kind of get some closure for the families of those missing POWs who were never returned about and find out what had happened to them. And that's what ends up leading to eventually the United States trading with Vietnam again, as happens in the early 1990s. So the results of Vietnam total, I've actually been to the Vietnam Wall. My dad took us when I was 11. One of his good friends from college was killed in Vietnam in 1968. A friend of his at Henderson State University where my dad attended, and we got to trace his name, or my dad did. About 300,000 American servicemen were wounded, and $150 billion spent. What also happens, Kennedy's domino theory actually comes to fruition, and Laos and Cambodia also fall to communism, as well as Thailand. And what's sad is this government called the Khmer Rouge ends up killing 1.7 million Cambodians that they thought were resistant, this other tribal group and so forth within communism. And it is ethnic genocide, and it's kind of one of the lesser known ethnic genocides of world history, and it's terrible. In fact, just last year I taught a Cambodian student. I was asking him if his grandparents, until next time you should ask your grandparents about the Khmer Rouge, because they lived in Cambodia at that time and then immigrated to the United States later, because there's a riveting movie that was done in the 1980s called The Killing Fields, and it's about this journalist who comes across these fields where all these people are slaughtered. In fact, my wife worked, her former boss has been to Cambodia and actually has been there and seen the trees and so forth that these people were killed on, and bullets were expensive, and so they did other methods of killing them. It reminds me of what the Einsatzgruppen did on the Eastern Front during World War II to Jews and gypsies and other people they thought might resist. And it is one of the most tragic and horrific things in the 20th century, and the 20th century is full of tragic, horrific things. All right, we'll get to the election of 1972 and Watergate, which I love this picture I found of Nixon on the picture of Scarface. And I'll get to that later when we get to Watergate. But I always found this picture amusing.